and we talked about aldosterone as the second of the three hormones that affect fluid balance in the body. So the first two, ADH and aldosterone, those are the ones with more major effects, and those would be included in every textbook on this section. This third one, ANP, is not included in every book, and it's kind of newer in its discovery. And this one is somewhat less important than the other two for you to remember long term. But you still have to remember it for my class. But don't be surprised if later you go on and study further, you might not hear about this again. It depends on what book you have and what instructor. So this stands for atrial, as in atria of the heart. Atrial, natriuretic, this part coming from sodium, this part coming from urinary system. Natriuretic peptides. So this is a short peptide hormone, and you can call it ANP thereafter, ANP. And ANP acts in the opposite way of the other hormones that we discussed last time. It acts in the opposite way. I'm going to go ahead and put up all of the information about it and let you write that down before I discuss it more. So I think I'll start from the end of this slide. Atrial natriuretic peptide causes you to release more urine. So you can remember that from the uretic part of its name. It causes you to release more urine because you're not reabsorbing as much water out of the filtrate. So you will urinate more, you keep less water in the blood. Thus, this is the one that can decrease blood pressure. And that's actually the point of this hormone, ANP, is when your body detects that your blood pressure might be dangerously high, it will start making ANP to literally take some pressure off by getting you to urinate more fluids. So this one, ANP, acts to reduce blood pressure because we increase urine output. These other two hormones that we talked about last time have the opposite effect. They both increase blood pressure by decreasing urine output. They all start with A, they're all hormones, but those are their major effects. So what ANP actually does once it is produced is it signals the tubule system to reabsorb less sodium. We're reclaiming less sodium out of the filtrate to put back into the blood. So we get less water following the sodium. So question here, this is acting like the direct opposite of one of those other two in how it acts in regards to sodium. Which other hormone is this the direct opposite of in every way? Let's go back and look at this. Back. So ADH is the opposite in every effect except what's going on with sodium. So ADH is acting directly on water. ADH causes reabsorption of more water into the blood by making these aquaporin proteins. Aldosterone is the one that's acting directly on sodium. Aldosterone, if you took this slide about what aldosterone does and compare it to the next, they are exactly opposite. So both of these increase blood pressure, but aldosterone is doing that by reclaiming sodium from the filtrate antidiuretic hormone is reclaiming water. And those both have this same end effect, but aldosterone is acting on sodium first, and then water follows the sodium. ADH is acting directly on water movement from the start. So when you're studying these hormones, you want to group these two together in their overall effects. This one's different. ANP is the odd one out. It actually lowers blood pressure. It actually increases urine output. And all of those together will help control fluid levels in the body. You got to remember which is which and what effects they have. There will be a lot of short answer questions about that on the next exam. So that segment talks about just the water balance. Just the water balance itself. And we had a little bit of sodium involvement, but let's next look at how do we balance electrolytes. What have you learned is the definition of an electrolyte, if you have? It's a very boring and dry definition. I went and looked it up, what your book says. So these are some examples of electrolytes. These are the major ones I'm going to talk about. But what electrolytes are just compounds that form ions in solution. So if I take some kind of chemical compound and I put it in a watery solution and it falls apart because the water shakes apart its ionic bonds, that technically makes it an electrolyte. There are a lot of things that could fit into that definition of electrolyte that completely don't matter to the human body. Like you could get bromide ions, like bromine, in the body. They don't really do anything in particular. They're not as important as this set. So make a note that these are the ones that matter most to the human body. They are electrolytes. They are ions with different charges. But these are the ones that do particular functions in our body. These are the ones that we need large numbers of these to do something for us. Like for sodium, calcium, potassium, they're controlling neuron and muscle function. They've got to be moving across membranes, activating depolarizations, and so on. We need them to do that job. We need protons for various reasons, partly to control pH levels, which is a little bit more than I want to get into here. We need bicarbonate to help balance acid levels. Chloride, we don't get into that function in this class. But these are the major physiologically related ions. And I want you to be able to, if I give you a name, write the symbol. If I give you the symbol, tell me the name. So, what's this one? Chloride. You would call that chloride ion. What's this one? This is bicarbonate. This is bicarbonate ion. The others are pretty self-explanatory, but this one represents bicarbonate ion, chloride ion. The others you've looked at a lot more in AP1. So the levels of these particular electrolytes, the levels of them in our bodies are really important. Those are the ones that we must control their levels and keep them within a narrow range. The way that electrolytes enter and leave the body are generally the same way that liquids and fluids enter and leave the body. So we get them in our foods. Processed food has a lot of sodium, particularly. We're probably getting too much sodium from processed foods. Fluids have electrolytes, some more than others. And we also have some from interconversions in our body. That's how we get electrolytes in. The way that we lose them, you can't just think of a Gatorade commercial. They only show people sweating. You lose electrolytes. You can sweat them out, but you can also excrete them in feces and urine. And for your average person, these are the more major ways that your average person loses electrolytes. It's not through only sweat all the time. The more exercise you do, the larger percentage you lose through sweat, but these are incredibly important as well. To know that that's how we end up lacking electrolytes. We lose them through sweating, defecating, and urinating. So here's some more detail about that. We definitely lose some by perspiring, and the proportion is going to increase if the weather's hotter and or if we're doing strenuous exercise. That could change the proportions. We lose some in feces. You can add on to here in that nice blank space. We lose more when we have diarrhea than when we have normal feces. But for a person who is not particularly exercising or particularly having diarrhea, urine is the greatest source of electrolyte loss. And remember, electrolytes are supposed to be a component of urine. It's a normal thing to find. On those test strips, when we tested urine, there wasn't a box on there for sodium or potassium or so on, because it's so normal, it's not worth testing for that. That's a normal component. So when we lose electrolytes in these ways, if we don't replace them in some fashion, we will get levels of electrolytes that are too low to support body functions. So we would have an electrolyte imbalance where the levels of electrolytes in our blood are too low to support the nervous system, to support heart contraction. And electrolyte imbalances don't sound cool or really gripping, but if they're not right, the person usually will first be in a coma and then die. So this type of really dire circumstance, this could happen from dehydration. This could happen from hypotonic hydration, water intoxication that we talked about last time. Edema is not really going to get to this level, but those other two water imbalances could lead to electrolyte imbalances. Fortunately, our bodies tend to control our electrolyte levels without us being aware of it. This is controlled involuntarily. And one of the major controllers is aldosterone that we talked about a minute ago. Remember, aldosterone helps us retain sodium. We keep more sodium in the blood. Aldosterone also makes us excrete potassium into the urine. So I'm going to write that separately over here. It causes sodium levels in the blood to increase, and it causes potassium levels to decrease at the same time. So aldosterone is going to automatically raise blood sodium, decrease blood potassium. One of my grandpas had, for some reason, trouble maintaining sodium and potassium levels, and he also had blood pressure. He had hypertension, and those things were related to each other, but he tended to have too much sodium and too little potassium. There you will come across other people that have slightly too much potassium and too little sodium. There are very few people that have too much of both or too little of both, because when you regulate one, it changes the other in the opposite way. So aldosterone is the main regulator of sodium and potassium. For calcium, we've got different hormonal control. And this is going back to something that we talked about, I feel like it was January or February. And Sam, if you would move the camera over here, I'm going to repeat one of my best drawings from this class. So there was a day back in lab where I drew this picture of calcium movements in between bones and blood. This drop represents blood. So our calcium levels in the blood have to stay pretty constant. And on a day-to-day basis, it's more important to keep blood calcium levels regulated than it is to make sure bones are strong. So this problem of blood calcium levels can kill you quickly. Having weak bones, yeah, that's a problem for another day, another year, another decade. And this becomes important in osteoporosis. So we have two hormones that control moving calcium. One of them controls moving calcium out of the bones and into the blood. The one that does that is PTH. PTH is removing calcium out of your bones so that the blood levels stay high enough. And you would normally have PTH acting when your dietary calcium is insufficient, let's say. Thus, you pull calcium out of your bone bank. Thus, your bones get a little bit weaker every time you do that. Every day that you're making a withdrawal from your bone bank of calcium. The other hormone that opposes those effects, that one is calcitonin. So calcitonin, if I'm taking calcium supplements, if I eat massive amounts of cheese and milk and ice cream, it will move calcium out of the blood and back into the bones. So it has the effect of lowering blood calcium and also strengthening bones. Those two, parathyroid hormone and calcitonin, this one, it's harder to remember that that has something to do with calcium. This one's got calcium in its name. But that's the way they act, and I want you to know or recall which way do they act and which one would more contribute to osteoporosis, questions like that. Okay, so that's the end of me talking about electrolytes specifically in this class. It doesn't do them justice, but when you go to exercise phys, when you go to nursing, by the way, don't throw away these notes if you're going to exercise phys and or nursing. You need them. I actually designed them in a way that makes them good for reviewing. Or when you get to a section in that class and you think, I don't know, I have no idea, go and look at these and brush up on your background for this. Don't get rid of these notes. So we're going to go on next and talk about acid-base balance. So we've talked about water balance a lot, electrolyte balance a little bit, and now we get into acid-base. And I do more on this section than other sections because when I ask nursing instructors through the years what do students seem to be struggling with the most, they always say electrolyte, fluid, and acid base. Again, you want to keep these notes so that you can use them as a foundation for later. This also comes into play in exercise phys a lot because we're going to be talking about breathing, producing acid, which we do through anaerobic exercise, and other factors like that. So here's the boring definition of what an acid is. They ionize in water, so they're electrolytes, and they release hydrogen ion. How do I write hydrogen ion? What does that look like? H plus. So this is hydrogen ion. It's acid. It's proton. Okay, so it can have 3 different names. And you should know all the names and know that they are all talking about one thing. Different books will call them different things. They're all the same things. Hydrogen ion is the same as a proton and is generally the business part of what we call an acid. All the same, H plus. So an acid is something that creates H plus in solution, is another way to think about it. A base are substances that combine with hydrogen ions, or you can think of a base as something that removes or something that neutralizes the acid. So the technical way to describe that is it combines with hydrogen ions. To me, an easy way to think about it is it binds with this and neutralizes it so it can no longer contribute to acidity. That's what a base really is. Here's the next thing you need to remember, the concept of pH. The concept of pH. pH is a measurement of hydrogen ions, or a measurement of acidity, and this concept, you don't want to get this backward. Remember how pH is the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration? Did your brain just shut down and block it out? Did you have to do those problems somewhere in your past? Anyway, that mathematical formula means that when we measure acidity, or the concentration of hydrogen ions, we do that on this pH scale. What's the highest possible pH number? 14. I mean, like in the world. For people, it's 8, yes. In the whole world, outside of people. What's the lowest? Good. Somebody showed it with their hand. 0. And then we've got 7 is technically neutral in the world. So it goes from 0 to 14. The lower the number, the more acidic. The higher the number, the more basic. Just don't forget that. I know that you've got it in your memory. Don't forget it. We'll come back. Yeah, and I put this picture in. You don't have this in your slides at this point, but you've got it later. So notice, this is starting at 6.8 and going up to 8, because that's, any pH outside of that is incompatible with human life. So compared to here, when we talk about physiological pHs, we're only concerned with that little segment, and anything beyond it is death. Or for chemistry lab. Or we're talking about microbes that are weird compared to us. So for people, we're only concerned with pHs in the range between 6.8 up to 8. That's our survival range. Look how little our normal range is. This is our normal pH range. This is what our bodies are maintaining for us most days. 7.35 to 7.45. I want you to memorize those. 7.35 to 7.45. That's what we've got to stay in normal pH range. If we're anywhere above that, we say that a person is in alkalosis. Like alkaline. Osis problem. Alkalosis. Sorry. Alkalosis. If we are more acidic than 7.35, we are in acidosis. And the osis tells you that's a problem. got acidosis or you've got alkalosis if we're not staying in this tiny narrow window of pH ranges. So that's kind of a preview of here's where we're supposed to be. If we're up in here, it's called alkalosis, it's a problem. If we're down in here, it's acidosis, that's a problem. Now we go back and talk about what makes us have the pH that we have. So here's a place for you to write down those numbers again if you didn't already. We have to maintain pH of body fluids between 7.35 to 7.45, which is, compared to, just pure plain old pH scale, we're a little bit more alkaline than that. We're a little bit more basic than true neutral 7, but that's what we have to be to work properly. And the reason for that is if we're outside those levels, our enzymes start to change their activity, which I'm not going to get more into here, but it's an enzyme thing. Enzymes require that pH range to work well. And at this point, if you've ever read anything on Facebook, Insta, Snapchat, social media stuff, that people can be too acidic, your body's too acidic, you need to eat an alkalinizing diet, that's pretty much ridiculous. Our bodies are maintaining our pH generally between this, and if we're not, you'll know it. You're not going to be walking around generally too acidic without knowing it, and some quack specialist says you need to eat these vegetables. The vegetables are good for you, but people generally don't have a problem with being overall drastically too acidic. But we do tend to drift toward acidity. So if we're talking about, here's our ranges, 7.35, 4.45, 3.5. We tend to drift more often towards acidosis, or get too much acid than too little, because of the way our bodies work. So here's why. And Sam, if you would move the screen again. The camera, sorry. So the first reason is that when we're burning sugar and doing aerobic respiration, we make CO2 at the end. And we're going to write that equation again that I mentioned to you a couple weeks ago. CO2 in water combines to form something called carbonic acid. And carbonic acid normally falls apart or ionizes into protons and bicarbonate ions. And I want to go in and fill in the names of these substances too. What's this one? Carbon dioxide. So know the symbols and the name in words. Yell it. Yep, water. This one is carbonic acid. That's one, not everybody, oh yeah, carbonic acid. Well, that's carbonic acid. What's this one? Hydrogen ion or proton. I guess I'll put it here as hydrogen ion, which we think of as, that's the acid. And what was this one? This is bicarbonate, and I would like you to call it bicarbonate ion, specifically in this class. So, this whole equation is reversible. And this is a part where I'm gonna stop and stay on this for a few minutes because it's so important to understand why sometimes we get out of our normal range. There are a lot of things that can affect this. So, if we have more carbon dioxide than usual hanging around in our blood, that pushes this equation this way. This whole thing can go either direction. It's reversible. So if I add more CO2 or I keep more CO2 in the blood and I don't get rid of it, it pushes the whole thing this way and it makes us more acidic. Does that make sense? But if I'm getting rid of CO2 a lot better, go ahead and draw reversible arrows here. If I'm suddenly getting rid of CO2 more than usual, the whole equation is going to shift in this direction and it's going to remove acid. So I want to make a note about that. Let's not call it releasing. Let's call it exhaling CO2 removes acid because it pulls the equilibrium this way. Some of you have had chemistry, maybe some of you haven't, but if you take away this, the equilibrium shifts and we're removing acid. But if for some reason we're exhaling less CO2, that's going to increase acid. It's going to increase acid. And I'm going to come back and add to this in a minute. But every day we're making CO2 because we're doing aerobic respiration. We're burning glucose in our mitochondria, and the CO2 is supposed to be in the blood, pass by the alveoli, and do gas exchange, and we blow it out. That's what's supposed to happen. If something goes wrong with that, our blood will build up more and more CO2, and it will get more acidic. Okay, the second thing that can happen to cause our bodies to acidify is that we are doing anaerobic respiration. We're working so hard, exercising, that we make lactic acid. That's a real thing if you're working anaerobically. And that's an acid. And that generally would be adding into acid levels in generally, not because of this equation, but lactic acid is an acid and it's going to acidify our bodies. That can be adding acid. And then the third one, I know this is low down on the slide, is about ketones or ketone bodies. And this semester I didn't quite talk enough about ketones up before now, but when you're burning fat for energy, more than carbs, you produce these waste products called ketones, and ketones act like an acid. Times when you would be producing more ketones than others is if you're doing low carb or keto diet. So helpful they're calling it now, keto diet. It helps you learn this a little bit better. You're burning fat for energy because carbs are not available. And that's going to make your body a little bit more acidic than it normally would be. The other times, if you don't have enough to eat, and if you have diabetes, which means you're eating enough sugar but you can't use it, it's stuck in your blood, you turn to fat, you produce ketone bodies. That was on the urine strips. Did you notice that? Don't raise your hand if you had it. A lot of things can cause it. Any of these can cause it. But they're acidic. So those are generally the sources of acids that I want you to know for this class. They're coming from metabolic processes. So here's ketone bodies. And it's saying here it's incomplete acid oxidation of fatty acids. We're burning fats for energy, producing ketone bodies. Or we're doing anaerobic exercise and we're making lactic acid. Or we're producing CO2, which is talking about this. So carbonic, lactic, and ketone bodies. These two happen. I'm not going to focus on them in this class because they tend to be less, they have less effect, a lower effect. They happen. I'm not going to talk about them anymore, but I want you to know these for sure. All of those increase acid in the body. So, are these raising pH or are these lowering pH? They're lowering. They're making us more acidic, so they're giving us a lower pH. Remember, pH numbers go opposite to the level of acidity. So we can't get too acidic. It's bad for us if we do. Here's how we avoid it. How do we avoid becoming too acidic, or how do we avoid acidosis? First is that we have chemical buffer systems in our body, in the blood. And I made this all black so you don't have to write it down, you can just listen. The main buffer system is, skip ahead here, the bicarbonate buffer system. That's the major one that you need to remember. And buffer systems basically work to soak up extra acid or base and prevent the pH from doing big swings. That's a chemistry topic that I'm not going to get into in depth. But buffers keep our blood pH more stable. And the largest one that is important in that is bicarbonate ion, which is related to that equation. There are other buffer systems that rely on proteins and phosphate molecules, but bicarbonate is the one that's most important for this class. And it depends on how many bicarbonate ions do we have here. So let's add in, I'm going to change marker colors, and if you could move the camera over. So our levels of bicarbonate ions, if we don't have enough bicarbonate ions, that's going to shift this equation this way. I'm going to say that again. If our bicarbonate levels are too low, the whole equation shifts this way and it makes more acid. I'm not going to really ask you whether that makes sense. Just either say in your mind, yeah, that does, or just take my word for it. If we have too little bicarbonate, that is going to increase acid levels. We hardly ever have a problem where we have too much bicarbonate, so I'm not even going to write it down. But the opposite would apply. If you have too much bicarbonate, it technically can make you too alkaline, but that hardly ever happens.
I have a question then.
Yes.
So you know back like a few slides back where you said that where it was like our bodies tend to acidify, and the third one was the ketones. You said they act as an acid.
Yes.
So then wouldn't that take it that way and it would be...
Because that's such a good question. I should tell your chemistry teacher that you asked it, if you're in chemistry. If the ketones were exactly this form of acid, that would be true.
Oh, okay. So
but they're not.
Just acid. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not the exact.
Yeah.
All right.
But that's such a good question. They don't drive this equation backward, though. They're a different form of acid, slightly than this, and thus it does not.
Like act directly.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can think of it more of as it adds to the overall acidity in the body.
Okay.
Such a good question. I love it. Who's your chemistry teacher?
I took it with Dr. Pickett a couple of years ago.
A couple of years ago? I'm impressed. Okay. So we have buffer systems that help us maintain our pH. The other big maintainer of pH is by literally breathing out CO2. And this is called blowing off CO2. Don't worry about it. We blow off CO2, and by doing so, it's leaving our body. It's pulling this equation to the left, and we reduce our acidity levels. So I want to go through the chart, or the whatever this is, diagram. On a normal day, we're always producing CO2 if we're living. That's never going to stop. We're supposed to be getting rid of it. It's supposed to be in the blood with water. It's normal that it produces carbonic acid. It's normal that carbonic acid ionizes to make protons. But our brain is checking proton levels for us. It senses proton levels. We've got chemoreceptors that sense, too acidic, too many protons. And that automatically is supposed to adjust our breathing so that we breathe out more CO2. And we may not even know it. Those of you that are going into nursing and you're required later to assess people's respiratory rate, how fast are they breathing? Because you're trying to detect, are they trying to get rid of CO2 more than usual? If they're breathing faster than usual, it might indicate that they have a pH problem. And they might not even know it. Like most of us don't sit around, oh, I'm breathing really fast right now, if we're not exercising. But that's why you check for it. It can be an indicator of our body's trying to fix a pH problem for us. And I guess as an example, people that have problems in their kidneys, for example, that they're not excreting acid the way that they should, their respiratory rate will rise because they're trying to get rid of CO2 by breathing it out and they don't even know it. But you could measure it and write down elevated respiratory rate, and then that's an indication, oh, we should check their pH levels because maybe they're involuntarily trying to get rid of acid. So we have buffers in our blood, mainly bicarbonate. We can blow off CO2 through normal respiratory processes, ventilating our lungs. And we can also get rid of acid by making our kidneys put more acid into the urine. That gets it out of our bodies. We're going to pee out acid. That's a way that we could reduce the acidity of our body fluids. An example of when that would be happening is you eat a lot of protein. You end up making these acids I said that don't worry about. You also make ketone acids, not shown. Your body detects that you have too much acid, and it will signal your kidneys to secrete acid into the urine through tubular secretion. And if you go back and check your tubular secretion notes, you've got it written down that acid, H+, is one of the things that can move back into the urine. And you could detect it on a urine strip. What a bird. Spring will be here soon. So if your urine is too acidic, that's an indicator that maybe all of your body fluids are too acidic and your kidneys are trying to help you out by getting rid of it. This is a pretty good little video made by dental students at some other school to talk about how these things are related to hyperventilation. It's linked on Blackboard. We're not going to watch it right now for sake of time. Because I want to finish this up. On Monday, we have an active learning about acid-base problems that we'll be doing in class, and I'm going to bring the worksheets to class for us to do that. But we need this background information first. So usually, our buffers, including bicarbonate, our breathing, and our kidneys are usually good enough to take care of our pH and keep it between 7.35 and 7.45. You've got those memorized already, right? Yeah. So that we don't fall into acidosis or alkalosis. So I want to go through those individually. Acidosis is our body fluids are too acidic. They're below pH 7.35. And if our blood pH is 7.35, most other body fluids will be close to that as well, except for possibly urine. So if we have acidosis, it could be for two reasons. It's usually because we're just accumulating acids, which we do daily, and we're not getting rid of them. Once in a while, it might be because we're losing base from our body. Either we get too much acid or we're lacking base to neutralize it. Either of those things can cause acidosis. Either of those things give us more protons, lower the pH. Once we're below 7.35, we say that that's acidosis. Here's the things that can literally cause acidosis to your average person. Number one, breathing problem, because you can't breathe out CO2, and you may or may not be aware that this is happening. I mean, there are people that, pass out before they ever even know that any of this is happening. So, either they are not breathing, or they're breathing too slow, or they're breathing too shallowly, or maybe they have a hot dog stuck in their trachea. Literally can't breathe. They've got airway obstruction. What should you do? Heimlich. On yourself or on them. Let them get air in. Or they can't do gas exchange in their lungs anyway. They've got pneumonia. They've got fluid around their alveoli. They're not doing gas exchange. They can't get rid of CO2. Any of those things can cause respiratory acidosis. This is respiratory acidosis. You can't breathe out CO2. Okay, second cause is a metabolic cause. You have too many ketones for any of those reasons that we talked about. Keto diet that you're not being real careful about and following the guidelines. Diabetes, malnutrition, starvation, too many ketones. That will cause metabolic acidosis. All of these are metabolic acidosis. Maybe your kidneys are failing and you can't get rid of, where'd this go? You can't get rid of acid because you just have kidney failure in general. That's going to be metabolic acidosis. Something else that can cause it, this is the part where you're losing base. You're losing a base. You're losing alkalinity. And usually that's because you are having diarrhea. Because your body is supposed to be reabsorbing bicarbonate, and if you have diarrhea, you're not. So you're losing base. It's mostly just take my word for it. You lose base when you have diarrhea. Or if you're vomiting so hard that you are getting down into intestinal contents past the stomach, and you're throwing up intestinal contents, you're throwing up bicarbonate and alkaline secretions, and thus your body is getting rid of too much base, and thus you have metabolic acidosis. We'll be reviewing this in the ALA on Monday. So maybe you've got too much acid, maybe you've got too little base. All of that could cause acidosis. For alkalosis, that's when your blood pH is getting too high. This is much less common. This is less common, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. People tend to drift toward the acid more than the base, but if you get above pH 7.45, that's alkalosis. And this can happen because you've got too much base, which is kind of even more rare, or you're losing too much acid. You can get too basic, too high of a pH because you lose acid or because you accumulate base. You can have alkalosis because you're hyperventilating. You're getting rid of too much CO2. This is why people that hyperventilate and don't stop soon, they're going to pass out because their blood is getting too alkaline. So they're exhaling too much CO2 and pulling the whole equation this way, and they're getting more alkaline. That's respiratory alkalosis, and these are the reasons why people could be breathing too fast. They're anxious, they have a fever, and they don't even realize that they're doing that. They have had a particular poison, not every poison, particular ones will make people do this, or they're at high altitude. They blow off too much CO2 that in essence pulls acid out of the body, and they get alkalosis. You can also have alkalosis because you're losing acid in other ways. If you're vomiting at a normal level, like you're not getting all the contents down out of the intestine, but you're just vomiting stomach contents, you're vomiting stomach acid, and that's large amounts of acid leaving your body. And that is probably the most common cause of metabolic alkalosis. You just get rid of too much acid. If little kids eat, poison or pills or something like that, and they have to have their stomach pumped, medical officials, as soon as they get the stomach pumping done, they have to worry about the person's pH level because they just remove so much acid. So, yeah, it's not good. Take care of the poison first, then take care of the pH. That would be metabolic. Oh, that's the end? Metabolic alkalosis. It's a good thing that that's the end. You need to bring, especially these acid-base slides, you need to bring this with you on Monday. You need to look at them because I'm going to be asking questions like, how did the person end up this way? What could help them? Yeah.
When's our next test?
I think it's Wednesday. It's next Wednesday. And the study guide that's on Blackboard will be generally pretty useful to know what will be on that exam.
So you're posting the study? That's what you got?
There's an old one that's on there, but